Good afternoon. So I'm going to talk through the material that's in Chapter 6 of the Green Budget, which looks at incapacity and disability benefit policy, in particular focusing on working age individuals. This is an important part of the working age benefit system. We spend in the current year about £24 billion, that's a quarter of the working age benefits bill, on incapacity and disability benefits, and they benefit 3.5 million individuals. So up front, I'll give you a couple of definitions. Incapacity benefits, that's things like employment support allowance. What they're trying to do is to provide financial support to those people who've got ill health or disability, which means they can't secure an income from employment. Now, these benefits are typically means tested. They're typically going to relatively low income individuals. In 2016-17, the average payment was worth about 19% of average male full-time earnings, and that's down from about 24% of average male full-time earnings 30 years ago. And then we have disability benefits, which are trying to achieve a very different thing. They're typically not means tested. What they're trying to do is compensate people who have a health condition, which means there's an additional financial cost on their cost of living. So we're trying to compensate people for those increased costs that they've incurred. And when we look at spending on these two types of benefits over time, we can see some very different trends. So starting with incapacity benefits, you can see that in real terms, spending shot up through the 1980s, but then it's been pretty stable since the mid-1990s, with a slight drop down due to a reduction in the caseload. As a share of GDP, our spending on incapacity benefits has fallen, driven by that decline in the average generosity of payments that I highlighted a moment ago. But in contrast, spending on disability benefits, both in real terms and as a share of GDP, have increased very significantly since 1992. So this graph has told you how much we spend and how much we're forecast to spend. It's important to note that the forecasts in this area have proved in recent years to be very inaccurate. So on this chart, you can see that we spent about £15 billion on incapacity benefits in 2015-16. If you go back to 2012 and you look in the OBR's budget document, you'll see that they're actually forecasting spending of about £10.5 billion in that year. So I want to spend a bit more time talking about those forecasts and the kind of errors that we've been making. But what it boils down to essentially is some reforms that were implemented with the intention of trying to cut spending on those benefits, and those reforms not saving as much as was hoped. And the OBR have said themselves that the impact of those reforms has been hard to forecast and prone to optimism bias. So if we go back to the autumn statement of 2012, for incapacity benefits, the OBR was projecting a real fall in spending of 27%, and for disability benefits, they were forecasting a real increase in spending of 6%. What actually happened is that incapacity benefit spending has risen by 6%, and disability benefit spending has risen by 35%. Now, of course, there's two reasons why you might get your forecast wrong. You might underestimate the number of people who are going to be receiving those benefits, or you might underestimate how much on average they'll get to receive. And we've been making both errors. So the OBR has both underestimated the number of people that would qualify for incapacity and disability benefits, but it's also underestimated the number of people who will be qualifying to receive those benefits at relatively higher rates. So I'm now going to talk a bit more about incapacity benefit, about the types of people who'll be receiving them and how that's changed over time. If we start with men, you can see back in 1995, rather astonishingly, nearly 1 in 4 men aged between 55 and the state pension age was receiving incapacity benefits. And that claim rate has dropped dramatically over the 20 years up to 2015. So while it's still the case that older men are more likely to receive those benefits than younger men, that gradient with age is much shallower compared to what it used to be. Another big trend that we've seen is that in the past, women were less likely to receive these benefits than men, but that's no longer the case. In both the 25 to 54-year-old age group and the 55 to state pension age group, the claim rate of women is now exactly the same as men. So there's been a shift away from older men receiving these benefits. In microdata, we can also look at the education levels of people who are receiving these benefits. We start here, look at older men who've got a high level of education. You can see that their probability of claiming incapacity benefits has fallen very dramatically over the last almost 20 years. But if we take younger men with a low level of education, you can see that their incapacity benefit claim rates have increased over this period. And it's quite a remarkable turnaround. Back in 1998, the older, high-educated group was more than twice as likely to be receiving incapacity benefits as the younger, low-educated group. By 2016, that situation had reversed, the low-educated younger group being twice as likely to receive incapacity benefits as the older, high-educated group. And you see the same pattern for women, decline in receipt amongst the older, high-educated group and an increase in receipt amongst the younger, low-educated group. We can also look at the principal reason why individuals are receiving these benefits, and there's a very high prevalence of mental and behavioural disorders. Now, it's 50% of claims are due to those reasons. That's an increase from 31% back in May 2000. And we also see very dramatic variation across the country. If you go to Hart in Hampshire, which I'm reliably informed is one of the nicest places in the country to live, 2.2% of the working age population are receiving incapacity benefits. If you go to Blackpool, it's almost 6 times higher at 13% of the working age population. And we've also looked in microdata at people aged 50 and over who are receiving these benefits, and we find an extremely high prevalence of multiple health conditions. So 37% of people who are receiving incapacity benefits have 6 or more health conditions. Now, this all matters because the government wants to try and get more people who are disabled into paid work. And the government's decided to highlight this disability employment gap. So in the most recent year in the labour force survey, 1 in 6 working age individuals report being disabled. And you're probably not surprised to hear that their employment rate is much lower than the non-disabled population. So about half of the disabled working age population are in work compared to about 4/5 of the non-disabled working age population. And we can see how this disability employment gap has evolved over time. It fell during the early 2000s, but has been pretty stable since 2011 and now stands at 32 percentage points. And the government has committed itself to halving this 32 percentage point disability employment gap. Now that's a very, very ambitious goal. It would require reducing non-employment amongst the disabled by 1/3. So if you take disabled working age people who are not in paid work, you've got to get 1 in 3 of them into paid work to meet this target. And another reason why it's going to be very difficult to achieve is when you look at how the gap varies by level of education. So if we take just individuals aged between 25 and the state pension age, you can see that that disability employment gap stands at 36 percentage points at the moment. But if you look at employment rates amongst the healthy population, you can see very little gradient by education. And that's in strong contrast to the disabled population. Low-educated disabled people are much less likely to be in paid work than high-educated disabled people. So it means that this disability employment gap is much, much bigger for the low-educated than the high-educated. It's twice as big between the low and the high-educated group. This really matters because amongst disabled people who are not in paid work, well, just over half of them are actually in that low-educated group. So the government's trying to halve this disability employment gap. It involves getting large numbers of disabled people into work, many of whom have low levels of education. And there's been a recent green paper which is considering reform of incapacity and disability benefits to try and move towards meeting this goal. And incapacity and disability benefits won't be all of the story. There's lots of disabled people who are not in paid work who are not receiving these benefits, but they might be part of the story. Just over half of non-employed disabled people are receiving them. So this green paper was published in October 2016. It's a joint paper between the Department of Health and the Department of Work and Pensions. An important thing the government's trying to stress is it's not trying to make the social security system less generous in terms of, so it's not looking for more cuts to incapacity or disability benefits. Its focus is on reducing this disability employment gap. And I should say that's really in contrast to many of the measures we've seen implemented since June 2010, which have made the social security system less generous for people on incapacity and disability benefits. To give one example, people who have been deemed too ill to work and therefore qualifying for employment support allowance, but they've been deemed healthy enough to engage in work-related activity, so they're in this RAG group. From this April, they'll qualify for £73 a week for benefit, in contrast to the £102 a week of benefit that they can currently receive. So one important part of the Green Paper is actually focusing on the other set of people on employment support allowance. So this is the group of people who've been deemed too unwell to be able to work, but also too unwell to be able to engage in work-related activities. And they're actually the majority of ESA recipients. There's 1.5 million individuals in this situation. And there's two types of reforms that the Green Paper talks about. One is a key role for job centre work coaches. So these are work coaches based in job centres who the government envisages giving them greater discretion to try and engage with people in this ESA support group in trying to get them to involve in work-related activity in a way which is really tailored to their health conditions. The other thing the Green Paper does is raise the possibility of applying sanctions, or at least the threat of sanctions, to at least some people in this group. This would bring them into line with recipients of other out-of-work benefits, people receiving job seekers allowance, or indeed the ESA work-related activity group. So what are the issues with these three proposals? Well, I think the first thing to say is that if you're going to do a significant amount of engagement with those in the support group, you're going to have to provide a lot of resources. There's 1.5 million people in the support group. That compares to just 0.4 million people on ESA work-related activity and just 0.5 million on job seekers allowance. So the support group in its entirety is 50% bigger than the people on ESA RAG and job seekers allowance put together. So it's a lot of people the government might be trying to engage with. If individuals have got multiple, complex and fluctuating work conditions, health conditions, you might think that the increased discretion is a good idea, and this could be one way in which work coaches could play a successful role, but it's not a given. Can you actually design this and get this to work? And if you do, can you do it in a way which is going to be consistent and fair? Is there not a risk that two individuals with the same health conditions, perhaps in different parts of the country, might end up getting treated differently by the benefit system? And finally, there's a question about whether sanctions for this group would be appropriate. These people have been deemed to be, by the current government, sufficiently unhealthy to be able to, so they can't work, but also so they can't engage in work-related activities. The government's proposing the possibility, at least, of sanctioning them if they don't engage in work-related activities. Now, the current approach is one where these individuals can volunteer for activities if they want to, and very, very small numbers actually choose to do that. The government seems to be suggesting the possibility of sanctioning, mandating these activities, which, if you like, could be seen as the alternative extreme. But perhaps the government should consider other mechanisms, perhaps trying to move to a world where we presume that these people should and can engage in work-related activities, but perhaps give them the right to opt out if they feel that's not for them. This is exactly the approach we do with workplace pension saving, where rather than force people to save in a workplace pension, or rather than just leave them alone to volunteer to save, we automatically enroll them, we presume they should save, but we let them choose to leave if they want to. So to conclude, spending on incapacity benefits is forecast to actually reach its lowest level as a share of GDP for nearly 40 years. And when we look at the types of people receiving these benefits, we see some very interesting trends over time. These benefits are not going to older men to the same extent as they used to, but they're increasingly going to people with low levels of education. And the principal cause of half of ESA claims is now mental and behavioural disorders. The government's committed itself to halving the disability employment gap, and unfortunately I think this is unlikely to happen, or at least unlikely to happen anytime soon. It requires reducing non-employment among the disabled by 1/3, and it's worth noting that 54% of those who are disabled and not in paid work have low levels of education. So it may not just be about their health conditions, they may well have low skills, which will make it harder to get them into employment. And finally, the Green Paper has proposed increased discretion for work coaches and greater engagement with the ESA Support Group, and that could help reduce this disability employment gap. But it's worth noting, I think it will require a significant resource if you're going to do a substantial amount of engagement. It's certainly not without risks, and I think in this area of policy there's a very strong case for the government trialling and thoroughly evaluating different approaches to see what works best. Thank you.